Boa tarde, pessoal. Mais um mês
Tarde.
aí.
Boa tarde.
Ricardo, Jamanta, Alexandre Pedroso. Boa tarde a todos. Mais um final de semana aí de conteúdo técnico bacana. Final de maio, né? Já esfriando aí em muitas regiões. A gente tá um pouquinho de
Rapaz,
blusa já. Isso é muito bom.
friou com força aqui, hein?
Nu?
Isso é muito bom para quem produz, né? Porque agora a gente tem um clima mais propenso. Os animais
As
consomem
vaquinhas
mais.
adoram.
Adoram o gado de corte também, né? Todo mundo fica satisfeito, entra no período de entre safra dessas commodities, o preço tende a subir, então é tudo de bom. Então vamos lá, dá um alô aí, boas-vindas aí, o Ricardo, já manda para a turma.
Gente, tudo bem? Boa tarde, bom final de semana aí para vocês. Feliz de estar de novo e bora para mais um webinar.
Boa.
Boa tarde, pessoal. Marcelão, Ricardão, quem está nos assistindo aí, muito bom estar aqui com vocês mais uma vez. E sempre é muito prazeroso juntar essa turma de peso para falar sobre um assunto tão bacana aí. Vamos nessa.
Beleza. Turma, a gente tem feito aí a cada 15, 20 dias uma discussão de algum assunto técnico. Esse programa aí de educação continuada é muito importante para nós todos, né, que estamos na extensão, na produção, sempre está mantendo a viola muito afinada. Então, a gente falou de vários assuntos importantes, estresse térmico, robô e outros pontos, e hoje nós vamos falar, talvez, de uma parte mais importante da fazenda, que é a nova geração, né? São as bezerras,
Isso
tudo
aí.
que a gente está investindo de melhor. Tem muita coisa boa, desde útero, criação, manejo, produtos, até a gente produzir uma vaca que dure mais, não só na primeira lactação, nem na segunda, né? Normalmente uma lactação e meia, às vezes duas para se pagar, mas que seja mais saudável. Acho que essa é uma expressão que eu tenho escutado muito, tanto na pecuária quanto na agricultura. Um solo mais saudável muitas vezes diferente de um solo muito produtivo. É uma matéria orgânica melhor, um cálcio com mais profundidade, um fósforo, muita adubação com fertilizante orgânico. Então, essa linha ela segue também na pecuária. Então, a gente vai discutir um pouco aí nos maiores especialistas do mundo sobre a parte de criação desses animais na fazenda. Antes de começar, eu queria agradecer demais os parceiros, ô Gabriel. Sem a ajuda desses parceiros, a gente não conseguiria de jeito nenhum estar fazendo isso aí. São empresas que acreditam na educação do produtor, do técnico, do extensionista, para que cada vez mais a gente tenha mais capacidade de entender o que a gente está fazendo. Por quê? Só abrir um parênteses, né? A gente sabe que Estados Unidos de 90 até 2025, perdeu 100 mil produtores. E o número médio de vacas do rebanho cresceu abruptamente, tanto é que na Hoard a gente tem um espaço somente para fazendas com mais de 1.000 vacas em lactação. E isso é uma consolidação normal, né? Estava falando semana passada agora para um top 100 do leite em Ribeirão, e foi um ponto muito importante. Nós vamos ter que crescer. Quem planta milho, quem planta soja, quem planta café, quem tira leite, quem produz boi, quem confina, quem cria, quem recria, quem faz tipo, o que for. Porque é muito claro que as margens têm diminuído e a gente tem que ter mais animais. Então, para isso, a gente precisa de educação. Nós temos que entender cada vez mais. Então, novamente, muito obrigado a todos os parceiros que têm suportado aí esse projeto de educação continuada aí com a Hortz. O nosso anfitrião padrão, Renato Nogueira, não está com a gente hoje, faz muita falta, mas ele estará com a gente na próxima. Tá tudo certo, só muito trabalho. Então, na próxima ele vai estar com a gente. Ok? Macarrão,
Vamos
Alexandre,
nessa.
alguns comentários? Então, pessoal,
Não,
normal, a gente
vamos nessa.
a gente começa com o webinar, né? Escuta as palavras aí hoje de uma pessoa muito conhecida aí na parte de cria, e a gente dá uma parada a cada 15 minutos, faz alguns comentários. Vocês podem aí também colocar os comentários de vocês, tá? Perguntas, etc., mandando aqui pra gente, e vão para cima. Ok? Então, Henrique, pode soltar o boi.
Dairyman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I will serve as the host for today's program, which will focus on nutrition for dairy calves. There are tremendous opportunities to raise healthier calves by fine-tuning their nutrition to enhance both the performance and their health, but this requires an open mind and willingness to question some of the current calf rearing methods. Today's presenter will challenge some of the current dogmas surrounding colostrum feeding, milk composition, feeding planes, and weaning nutrition in calves. Our sponsor for this webinar is Protecta, and we thank them for their support of this Hoard Dairyman webinar. If you are listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF copy of the slides. You can find that in the GoToWebinar control panel. Just click the handout section, and there you will find a link to the PDF. In addition, if you have any questions for our speaker, you can type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will address them following the presentation. Today, we welcome Dr. Michael Steele as our webinar presenter. Dr. Steele completed his PhD at the University of Guelph and worked with Nutrico Canada Research or Agri Research for 2 years before returning to academia at the University of Alberta and later at the University of Guelph as a NSERC Industrial Research Chair. He recently received several honors, including the CSAS Young Scientist Award, the Cargill Animal Nutritionist Award, the Lallemande Award for Excellence in Dairy Nutrition Research, the American Society of Animal Science Early Researcher Award, and the ADSA Foundation Scholar Award. Dr. Steele's current research focuses on the mechanisms that control gastrointestinal health and development in cattle, and he has published over 150 manuscripts through his career. Dr. Steele, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled New Developments in Calf Nutrition, Challenging the Dogma.
Well, thank you very much, Abby, for that great introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about something that my lab's very passionate about. This is my second honor to be a webinar presenter for Hoards. So what I'm going to be talking about today is talking about some new developments in calf nutrition and where I would pinpoint where we should reevaluate things and challenge what we've been doing recently. So I'll first discuss opportunities, where I see the tremendous opportunities to be in early life nutrition of calves, and then talk about the neonate, so focusing on that first week of life, followed by the pre-weaning period, as well as weaning. So first things first is what our lab studies. Okay, so we look at early life programming and we think of a calf, even upon conception, as a ball rolling down the hill. And depending on the nutritional stimuli, either prenatally or postnatally, this can impact the future path of this calf. Okay, so it's really critical. It hasn't been studied that much in the dairy world. It's been studied a lot more in monogastrics. Even the beef industry, I think, is further ahead. So there's a lot to be done here. There's lots of great relationships that have been published looking at how early life nutrition or early life growth and health can impact future production. There's many different papers that can show that increasing average daily gain during the pre-weaning period can impact lifetime production. There's also other papers that have shown no response to accelerating growth and health in early life and also lifetime production. But there's yet to be one published paper showing any negative consequence of improving growth as well as health during the pre-weaning period with respect to lifetime production as well as survivability. So this idea and this concept is really geared through this idea of developmental plasticity. So we think of a calf, even upon conception, it can be molded into a different phenotype. And the plasticity is greater prenatally, but also postnatally, it's still very, very high. So there's lots of opportunity to change the future phenotype of this animal. Now, this is the replacement animal. What our lab has begun to study in great detail is also this crossbred animal in dairy beef. And actually, it's to our scientific advantage to do some of these studies because from start to finish, it's just over a year. So I think that this is a concept, and now that 30% of calves are being crossbred, it's not just replacement animals, it's also these crossbreds that we're using throughout the world. But we have a lot of issues, okay? This is with respect to replacement animals as well as crossbreds, okay? There's major gut health problems during the pre-weaning period. We still have lots of mortality and morbidity. Those numbers are still high. These are actually some of the lower numbers with respect to mortality and morbidity. Even in recent studies over the last 4 years, we've been noting even in Canada that 24% of calves failed passive transfer of immunity. So that's also no differences between male and female calves, which was very surprising in this study. And I think antibiotic use is still overused, okay? We're using way too much antimicrobials. And I don't think that a lot of the times it's really justified. So I think we have a lot of work to do here. And just because we have crossbreds, actually, they still have the same numbers from what we can tell. It might be a mild advantage, but still, there's a lot of mortality and morbidity in replacements as well as dairy beef. And this is important. Look at this is some data from a commercial dairy beef and veal farm in Ontario, Canada. This is published by my colleague Dave Renault's lab group. Just looking at the number of days with diarrhea during the pre-weaning period and how that's associated with a depression in overall growth. So you're going from close to a kilo all the way down to 800 grams when you increase from 0 days to 7 days with the diarrhea score. So this costs a lot of energy. It depresses overall growth, and it probably has a long-term consequence too. It can potentially impact production later on in life. So that's why I think it's really critical to feed calves the highest quality of colostrum, milk feeding, as well as starters throughout their entire pre-weaning as well as post-weaning period. Now, I'd like to focus more on the neonate at this point. So a lot of our research has been related to colostrum feeding. Of course, these are some of the basics that we're all reporting, our standards of 22 bricks, 60 gram per liter. I think we should actually consider reevaluating this and even going higher. Higher is always better. Quantity, so we're saying greater than 10% of body weight in the first 12 hours. I think that's great if your quality is really good. I would consider even feeding more. Now, when I say feeding more, I don't mean anything remotely close to 20% of body weight. I mean maybe 12%. Maybe if a calf can suckle at 15%, we should consider feeding more in the first 12 hours, so the first 2 meals of their life. Quickness, I think 24-hour surveillance is really critical. We have some data to support that. There's big differences in gut microbiota if you delay the colostrum feeding by 0 to 6 to 12 hours. Also the cleanliness, keeping this colostrum clean as well. Now, I'm going to show you some more recent data from our lab. This is, I don't like to admit this on a Hoard's webinar, but I also do beef research. And I do this because I can learn a lot from about the dairy cow from doing beef research. So we did some late gestation dietary treatments in beef cows. They were predominantly Angus crosses. And we looked at their IgG and their offspring. And as you can see, we're getting IgG values well over 50 gram. In fact, there was hardly any calves below 40 gram per liter of IgG. Now, when you compare this to some crossbred studies that we've been doing, and this is feeding lower amounts, so the calf isn't suckling, we're feeding 250 gram of IgG or 500 gram, you can notice a pretty big difference here. So although our standards say that we should be feeding a high quality colostrum, we should be feeding 10% or 22 bricks, these are what numbers we're actually referring to, I think that we can do a lot more, okay? So we can boost that quality and potentially look at increasing our volume as well. Now, not large volumes, okay, but manageable volumes. And as you can see, there's a big difference in our cutoff here of a Holstein versus a beef animal here. So beef animals are around 24 gram per liter. This is passive transfer of immunity cutoffs versus our 10. So I think we can learn a lot from this beef animal, probably our closest model to nature. Now, I get the question all the time, what do I do if I have low quality colostrum? If I have 30 gram per liter maternal, what can I do? Now, 60 gram, now this is a study where we actually fed maternal colostrum at 30 gram per liter, 60 gram per liter, as well as 90 gram per liter. And they were just fed under 10% of their birth body weight in the first meal with respect to volume. So as you can see here, they still passed even with 30 gram per liter. This is maternal colostrum being fed. 60 gram, there was a linear increase, and 90 gram per liter, it still increases. So these 90 gram per liter were actually consuming close to 400 grams of IgG in that first meal. And as you can see, we're not even reaching the maximum capacity of IgG absorption since this response is linear. But again, back to the question from farmers, I've got 30 gram per liter colostrum, what do I do? Well, we took colostrum replacer, so a dried whole colostrum source, and then we mixed it with this low quality, and you can actually boost the IgG in calves. And this is their blood circulation going from 11.76 to 19.85. Now we took that same 60 gram per liter maternal, we boosted it to 90 gram, a numerical increase, but not statistically significant. So it looks like enriching this low quality colostrum with a colostrum replacer, and in this particular case, it was a whole colostrum, may be used as a feasible strategy to ensure passive transfer. Now I will caution, this is just looking at IgG. As we know, there's hundreds of other bioactives within colostrum. Perhaps the enrichment from 60 to 90 had a positive benefit or maybe even a negative. We don't really know at this point. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that we're just looking at IgG, and that's only one of the hundreds of components within colostrum here. Another area of research related to the neonate that we've been challenging a lot over the last 10 years is this idea of transition milk feeding. Okay, so I think most of us are very familiar that we want to boost passive transfer of immunity by feeding really good quality meals of colostrum. But typically we have this abrupt transition to a whole milk or a milk replacer at 12 or even 24 hours of life. And really, when you follow this cow, there is a very gradual transition from colostrum to milk. So let's take a closer look at what I'm talking about. Here's a recent paper that we published looking at colostral peptides, so looking at lactoferrin, IGF-1, as well as insulin, and looking at the differences between multiparis MP and primiparis, as you can see. So as you can see, they're very high, even in the first milking, but also even in the second and third milking. It can have elevated levels of these biopeptides. And also oligosaccharides. So we know that colostrum is low in lactose, and what's making up a bulk of the carbohydrates in its place are colostral oligosaccharides, mainly being 3' sialactose being the most dominant one. But there's many of these different oligosaccharides, and they're the natural prebiotic that the cow is producing for this calf. So this is a food source for really healthy bacteria. They can also be pathogenic decoys as well. So it's surprisingly, we don't know that much about these oligosaccharides, but we do know that they're elevated in colostrum. And even in that second and third milking in lactation, they're still elevated. Also, colostral fatty acids. This is another paper that we published comparing milking 2, 3, 4, 5, and 12 to colostrum. So this is a heat map. If it goes from white to red, it means it's increasing. Okay, so if we look at C4, we don't have a lot of butyrate in colostrum. That's probably a good thing. We probably don't want to differentiate these fetal enterocytes within these calves, and butyrate will most likely do that in the gut. So it's interesting that it's low in colostrum than is elevated at milking 12. And if you look at the flip side, the N3, N6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, this is the green portion in the bottom right, it goes from very high levels to very low levels. So colostrum and transition milk have very high levels of these N3, N6 pupa, but when your lactation persists and then you're milking 12, these can decrease. So the cow is producing all these really unique bioactives, being peptides, carbohydrates, and fatty acids that are very unique in colostrum and also very unique in transition milk compared to whole milk. Okay, so there is this transition. Now, the first study that we ever conducted looking at this transition was when we fed all the calves a pasteurized colostrum source, and then we switched one group at hour 12 of life to pasteurized whole milk, and then another group with the 50% milk, 50% colostrum. Then another group we kept on colostrum, and then we dissected these calves at the end of day 3 of life. And what we found was really large differences between the milk group as well as the 50% milk, 50% colostrum, as well as the colostrum group. So these are really massive differences microscopically. So 150 micron difference between the 50-50 group and the colostrum versus the milk. So the surface area for absorption was dramatically different based on allowing this calf to be provided colostrum for a little bit longer. But no differences between this 50% milk, 50% colostrum group, as well as whole colostrum with respect to surface area of the villi.
Fenômeno, cara, muito bacana. Por mais que a gente continue lendo, sempre tem novidade. Então, assim, acho que depois de escutar o comentário aí do Alexandre e do Ricardo, né? Mas assim, colostro não é colostro. Tem muito mais no colostro que a gente imagina. Vamos lá. Eu tenho algumas perguntas, mas eu queria deixar aberto por enquanto aí. Alexandre, algum comentário?
Cara, não, só destacar, assim, pegando o gancho que você acabou de falar, né? Assim, os trabalhos do grupo do Mike lá mostram muito claramente, né? Mostram, não, né? Reforçam a importância de uma boa colostragem, enfim. E o meu comentário é que, como eu ainda vejo, me surpreende, na verdade, ainda vem, mesmo em fazendas boas, falhas gritantes no processo de colostragem. Sabe, eu acho que tem muita fazenda perdendo, assim, por um problema relativamente simples, talvez, de manejo, perdendo a oportunidade de garantir uma melhor transferência de imunidade passiva para as bezerras e sofrendo com isso depois, né? Me surpreende ainda um pouco isso, sabe?
Uma
Beleza.
coisa que eu queria acrescentar nisso aí eu acho que ainda existe um tanto bom de discussão, né, na literatura e entre filosofias de amamentação, né, aleitamento. Algumas focando mais no alto consumo de leite, baixo consumo de ração, desmama um pouco mais tarde, outros em baixo consumo de leite, alto de ração. Mas, assim, o ponto que eu quero falar agora, isso vai ser conversado um pouco mais para frente na palestra, mas o que eu quero falar agora é assim, não importando o seu programa de aleitamento, todos focam numa boa colostragem, né? Isso é
Exato.
igual a todos, então não tem jeito, né? A gente sabe o que realmente importa. E no campo, você vê aí claramente, ele comentou de talvez forçar um pouco mais no colostro. Quando eu falo forçar, na verdade, é dar um pouco mais de volume de colostro, né? De alta qualidade aí no nascimento. E, cara, você vê resultados fantásticos quando a fazenda está desequilibrada, e isso põe muitas vezes a taxa aí de doenças que essa fazenda está tendo de volta no trilho, sabe? Isso realmente é bom.
Não,
Legal. Nessa linha, uma
sem dúvida.
pergunta aí já, o Macarrão, que ele mostrou a tabelinha muito clara, né? Que isso a gente sabe, é algo que acho que todo mundo vê, mas ele colocou em números, né? Dias que uma bezerra tem diarreia e quanto isso impacta em ganho de peso. O americano é muito bom em modelar, colocar número, colocar valor, né? Eu lembro tanto que sofreram para falar, cara, como é que nós vamos achar um jeito de pôr condição corporal em vaca, condição corporal em teto, e eles acharam. E quando a gente acha, a gente pode colocar média, desvio padrão, coeficiente de variação, e aí a gente começa a medir. Então, nessa sua linha, Ricardo, aquela tabela, dias de diarreia, impacto no ganho de peso. Você quer dar uma comentada sobre ela?
Sim. Isso eu acho que é meio que óbvio, né? A gente tenta não voltar para. A gente pensa só animal como, sabe, uma peça no quebra-cabeça, mas se a gente pensar, né? Aí o frio começando, todo mundo meio gripado, e o nosso rendimento cai. E eu acho que é tolo não achar que o rendimento de um animal que ele apresenta algum tipo de desbalanço metabólico, ele não seja menor do que o esperado. E claramente, no caso, que a medida melhor em bezerra? É saúde, né? É crescimento. Eu acho que isso é meio que óbvio. E além disso, ele colocou só o custo no ganho de peso, fora todo o custo de tratamento que está envolvido. Ou seja, essa conta, não só no ganho de peso, mas ela é muito maior, pelo que você tem que fazer para trazer esse animal de volta para os trilhos, né?
Legal.
É isso aí.
Mas o que eu vejo que é importante, que é óbvio, muita coisa que a gente vê é óbvio, mas a gente às vezes não consegue convencer a pessoa que está cuidando da bezerra, não
Ah,
consegue convencer o gestor, não consegue convencer o nutricionista, porque a gente não tem número. Então, a hora que a gente chega na fazenda, vai dar um treinamento e eu tenho essa tabela, falo, olha, eu faço uma pergunta para a turma, na média tem 3, 4, 5 dias de diarreia, então nós estamos perdendo 200 gramas. Aí eu vejo quanto que custa esses 200 gramas, que é o número básico, aí começa a impactar no dinheiro. Aí eu consigo convencer. Aí começa a ficar legal. Mas beleza. E o outro ponto, ô Alexandre, que
Sim,
acho que é
senhor.
muito discutido em linhas diferentes, né? Acho que a turma do Michael Hamburg apertando aí no ganho de peso para produzir uma vaca mais lean, com menos gordura, e mostrando que um ganho de peso maior, desde que não engorde o animal, é bom. E uma outra turma fala, não, tem que ter um limite. Mas o comentário que ele fez, que eu achei legal, é que fala, cara, tem esses dois lados aí. Não falou assim, mas deixou claro. Mas nenhuma deles falou que ganho de peso é ruim, né? Então, pelo menos deixar essa imagem, né? Para a gente não falar assim, ah, mas então não pode ganhar muito. Não, ganha 600, 700, ok. Mas não tem nenhuma linha falando que ganhar 700 gramas é ruim, né? Então, você comentar nessas diferenças aí.
Não, o próprio Mike Webner mostra um dado lá, né, de relacionando maior ganho de peso na fase inicial com maior produção de leite futura, né? O que é um fato, a literatura mostra isso, né? Eu acho que no leite a gente discute pouco uma coisa que no gado de corte se fala muito, que é a composição do ganho, né? Eu acho que isso talvez seja uma coisa que tenha que passar a fazer parte da pauta, porque para mim é uma coisa que faz muito sentido, né? Quando você pensa em botar mais peso, só que esse peso vindo do crescimento de fato de órgãos, né, de tecido secretor, de musculatura, e não necessariamente de gordura, né, que todo mundo sabe também que quando a gente fala de gado jovem de bezerras durante uma fase da vida, deposição excessiva de gordura na glândula mamária é mortal, né? Eu acho que precisa mudar um pouquinho o enfoque de quem trabalha com nutrição. Ganhar mais peso é bom? É bom. Agora, onde vai estar sendo depositado, entre aspas, esse peso, né? Eu acho que esse é o ponto. Minha experiência mostra que quando a gente trabalha, e aí também tem muitos trabalhos lá da equipe do Tim Clegg, do Mark Hill, mostrando você fazer dietas líquidas com mais proteína, tem um benefício claro disso, né? Então, acho que a gente tem que olhar para essa questão de uma forma talvez um pouco mais parecida com uma turma do gado de corte que trabalha com crescimento de gado de corte faz, né? Que é olhar a composição desse ganho.
Fechou. Pessoal, beleza? Novamente agradecer aos nossos parceiros, né? Sem a ajuda deles aí, a gente não estaria aqui. E vamos então para o nosso segundo bloco de conhecimento aí.
The same study. This is just looking at IgG, and as you can see, this is the first meal. They all received the exact same meal as a percentage of body weight, and then the treatment started right at this 12-hour mark. And as you can see, they still get a boost of cholesterol of IgG from that second meal of colostrum. And the second meal wasn't as large as the first meal as well. Even the 50-50 group, you did get a boost. So what this is really telling us is that the gut probably is still open after 12 hours. Obviously, it is based on this huge increase in IgG even after 12 hours of life. And if you look at the appealing IgG persistency in this particular study, you'll also note that the calves actually fed the mix or the colostrum had greater persistency of IgG over the first days of life. Now, this is interesting. Even if the gut is closed, it's probably reducing the amount of IgG that's in circulation that's going back to the gut, since IgG is moving in multiple pools of this animal at this time of life. So interesting that there could potentially be a benefit there. So this has led to a lot larger scale studies that our lab has conducted, and there's some recently published data in this area in the Journal of Dairy Science. But just in review, the 50% colostrum, 50% milk for the first 2 to 3 days will increase intestinal development. We also looked at this in greater, biological replicate studies where we're looking at 200 animals. And the IgG after the first 12 hours of life is, of course, greater, but there's a reduced risk of mortality as well when we do these larger studies with the 50% colostrum, 50% milk for the first 2 to 3 days of life. Now, there's also extended colostrum feeding of smaller amounts of this colostrum replacer, so approximately 10% for the first 7 to 14 days is something that's commonly you see, at least here in Canada. And what's been noted in those studies is an increase in body weight, an increase in average daily gain, and a reduction in the risk of mortality, okay? So lots of, I think, benefits here. And if you want to take a closer look, you can actually search our papers in the Journal of Dairy Science, or I'd be happy to share them with you. So it looks like providing this transition from colostrum to a whole milk or a milk replacer can have a benefit. So that's most of the work related to neonatal that we're kind of challenging, you know, the amount of IgG that you could deliver to a calf in the first day and also how you transition. Now I'd like to discuss some of the newer concepts related to pre-weaning. And I'll start by first saying that during this pre-weaning period is when a lot of this disease is going to be occurring. And where the focus of the disease, at least for the 7 to 21 days of life, is going to be pathogenic diarrhea. And you see this all the time on so many different farms, the treatments of antimicrobials during this period as a means to try to control this, okay? Now, I think that this is really dangerous for the calf as well as for consumer perception. But let's just focus on the calf today. So as you can see, calves treated with antimicrobials during the pre-weaning period have lower conception rates. They have an increased time to first calving, increased risk of culling, and reduced milk production in the first lactation, okay? So we did a study. It was a farm that was using prophylactic neomycin. It was on a vet script that they were using this, and they were using it for the first 2 weeks of after arrival. So this is the same dairy, beef, and veal operation that I was discussing before. And like every single dairy, beef, and also veal operation, you have a lot of diarrhea in that first week or two after arrival. And this is why you have a depression in overall average daily gain, as you can see from this graph. In this study, we wanted to look at this neomycin in a short term, so the first 14 days, long term, the first 28 days. Again, this was with a vet script. I would not recommend this for home, as well as control, okay? So control received no prophylactic neomycin. Now, they also received therapeutic, but it was very small amounts with respect to a defined daily dose. So we found no differences in average daily gain. There was an increase in fecal score in the control, but the duration of the diarrhea and the resolution was not different. Okay, same with the incidence of diarrhea. There's no difference from this prophylactic neomycin, and also the day to the first diarrhea was also not different. So it made me wonder, and made the farm also wonder, if this is really advantageous for the farm. So they've since stopped using prophylactic antimicrobials in their facility. Now, we took the same study looking at the control short-term and long-term, and we dissected a subset of calves, and we noticed that, like you would expect, when you use a prophylactic neomycin or antimicrobial, you're going to be reducing the overall diversity of the microbial population within the gut. Now, this is well known. We're picking up these differences in the ileum in this particular study. But that's the microbes. We care about the calf. And we think that these antimicrobials can actually impact the calf, and they did. Increased gut permeability in these calves. It alters the metabolism of these calves. So, for example, bile acids and tissues and circulation were different. Expression of metabolism, immune genes, and adipose tissue was also different. Okay? So it makes me wonder, what are we doing to this calf? Is it possibly that we're changing its physiology? And does that change in physiology translate into its performance or phenotype later on in life? I don't think we really understand that right now, but this is very interesting to me that we could potentially be changing this calf in early life through these treatments. So we're looking at alternatives to antibiotic use. And we wanted to look at, and this was a collaboration with Dr. Dave Renaud here in the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. We went to the same facility that we just did the previous study. And as soon as calves had a fecal score of 2 or 3, we enrolled them into our study, okay? So they were randomly assigned to 3 different groups. A short-term colostrum supplementation that lasted 2 days or 4 meals, since these calves were fed 2 times a day, or a long-term supplementation being 4 days. So that's 8 meals of this particular treatment. So this treatment was actually just substituting 50% of the milk replacer with a colostrum replacer. And the duration again was 2 or 4 days. And then after this treatment, we were following the animals until 56 days after enrollment. And what happened when you do have this mixture of 50% colostrum, 50% diarrhea, and then, again, this is a dried colostrum source that we were feeding of a whole colostrum, so it had a lot of fat in it as well. And as you know, there's an increase in diarrhea resolution through the long-term group. So feeding this treatment for 4 days actually resolved the diarrhea faster. And also the growth rate. This is very interesting. In the growth rate, you know, there was no difference, of course, when you're administering this colostrum mixture in the first 4 days there. But later on in life, the long-term group that received this treatment had greater average daily gains and also body weight. So that's really amazing that a treatment in 4 days can actually result in a response at 42 and 56 days where you have different phenotypes based on body weight. So most likely there's something in the colostrum that's resolving this diarrhea and improving the gut. So that's a lot of the work that we're looking into, is finding alternatives for antibiotics. This is just one example of the research that we've been doing, looking at colostrum as a substitute. Now, I can't talk about pre-weaning without talking about milk feeding, okay? So we've been doing a lot of studies comparing high-low milk. I'm not going to discuss that too much today, but what I will say is that if fed properly, you can get really high volumes of milk into calves. If you don't have transport, I think there's a lot more advantages and possibilities of increasing this overall milk intake early in life. And this is a video of calves being fed 10 liters in 4 different meals, so 2.5 liter meals in the first 4 days of life, and they can suckle, they're not being transported. It's possible. And the results from this, when you compare, let's say, a 5 versus 10 liter feeding level, is you're going to have more growth in early life. In the first 3 weeks of life, when they're not consuming enough starter to contribute to growth, this is the true advantage of feeding more milk, especially if you don't have transport in that first week of life. I think that you can actually push more milk and provide more milk. It's their only calorie source. There's very, very few calories coming to concentrate in that first weeks of life. So basically the energy supply is coming from the milk. So if you don't feed it, you miss this average daily gain. It's very difficult to debate this, okay? So if you don't feed the milk in early life, you will never get this growth in the first 3 to 4 weeks of life ever again. That's gone, okay? Now you can catch up with starter intake, accelerating the starter intake, making sure you have group housing. That's a really good opportunity. Make sure you have a really good weaning strategy, but the first 3 weeks are gone, okay? There's no getting that back. Now, that's with automation. I get the question all the time. I have got large concerns with feeding 4 liter meals 2 times a day. There's papers showing that it reduces insulin sensitivity. It can't be a good thing. It's probably hard on this abomasum as well. So we wanted to look into that in greater detail. So what we did is that we fed these calves either 8 liters or 4 liters a day in 2 meals. So we were comparing a 4 versus a 2 liter meal. And we actually found no evidence of postprandial hyperglycemia. There was no difference actually in glucose tolerance tests before and after the weaning period. And what we did find is that these calves fed larger meals actually had a slower abomasal emptying rate, meaning that the calf can sense when it has a large meal in the abomasum and it releases that meal slower, so you have less glucose and insulin peaks postprandial, okay? So it's amazing how this calf can do this. And it's most likely coming from glucagon-like peptides being signaled in the distal part of the ileum, and that will affect the actual abomasal emptying rate. That's just a hypothesis of the mechanism, but it's amazing that this calf can sense it. And this is how the calf can actually reduce the high levels of insulin and glucose in circulation. And it can be safe, in my opinion, to feed a calf 4 liters a meal, even in the first weeks of life, if you have larger calves. When I'm saying larger calves, I mean over 40 kg. Now, that's milk feeding. I won't talk too much about milk feeding today. A lot of our work recently that we've been publishing has been looking at milk composition. And I'd like to first say I am not against milk replacer. In fact, I recommend it to many of the farms I work with, okay? I just have questions about it. My questions are, why is it, in general, not all milk replacers in the world, but in general, they're higher in lactose, lower in fat, and higher in ash? Now, we won't get to the ash today, but we'll focus on the lactose fat comparison. And just by nature, when you have more ash and lactose, you're going to have higher osmoles too. We also know that hypertonic milk replacers increase gut permeability. So most likely, if you have a high lactose, you're probably going to run a bit greater risk of a greater gut permeability. And it can also affect insulin sensitivity, at least in the first week of life, is what we've noticed. Okay. Now, here's just what it looks like when you compare a high fat versus a high lactose in an ad libitum system. Okay. Now, when we did this study, we were always told that feeding high fat, so the high levels of fat, they were about 28% in this particular study. And we were told that it would reduce starter consumption. As you can see, when you look at calf starter consumption, it did not, okay? So I think there's some misconceptions here. Of course, the milk intake in the high lactose group is greater, but when you correct for the energy, since the energy density is greater in the high fat, there was no difference pre-weaning, and there was no carryover effect post-weaning. Now, this is interesting because I don't think the literature would really support this. In fact, some of the growth rates that were achieved in this particular study are quite outstanding, and there's no difference between high fat and high lactose in this particular study, pre-weaning as well as post-weaning. And some of the average daily gains, look at the average daily gain at week 4. They're both above 1, okay? They're approaching 1.2. These are outstanding average daily gains for the first 4 weeks of life that can be achieved on both formulations. Now, these formulations, in a lot of cases, don't really result in differences in average daily gain. But when you look at their metabolic fingerprints between many of these different comparisons that I've been collaborating with the group from Trow Nutrition with, this is my PhD student. She just graduated, Juliette Wilms. She did comparisons with a dried whole milk versus a high fat. From a macronutrient standpoint, those treatments, the first 2, were almost the same. Okay, so they're the same fat, the same protein, the same lactose. But look at their metabolic fingerprint. They were completely different. Look at the high lactose, look at the high protein. Again, different metabolic fingerprints, even though their average daily gains in a lot of these studies was not different. If you look a little bit more deeply, we looked at the whole milk versus the high fat. We dissected calves from that comparison, and we found that the guts of the calves fed the whole milk were actually greater with respect to mass. They also had more surface area in the intestine for absorption. We think that this is probably to do with the fatty acid profile in whole milk versus a milk replacer, namely the short chain fatty acids that are typically missing in a high fat milk replacer. But I find this figure really interesting, that perhaps the way that we're feeding calves pre-weaning is imprinting them, and maybe there is a sustained response that shows up in phenotypes later on in life. Maybe there's different production. Something to consider, and something that our lab is really motivated to start following these animals with different formulations from the first months of life all the way until they leave the herd. Easier said than done, but we're a very ambitious group and we're trying our best to do that.
Enorme. Quanta novidade. Diferentes produtos, diferentes composições, diferentes peptídeos, ácidos graxos. Uma coisa legal que eu queria perguntar aí, talvez para o Alexandre, e eu falo isso porque minha esposa é médica e nutróloga, e ela trabalha muito com a questão da microbiota. Ele falou muito a utilização de antibiótico antes do desmame e quanto isso impacta a vida do animal depois na fase adulta. Você poderia comentar alguma coisa nesse sentido, Alexandre?
Perdão, pessoal. Também estou saindo de uma gripe aqui, a tosse ainda está um pouquinho persistente. Marcelo, isso para mim é uma coisa assim, eu não... Lógico, eu não trabalho com clínica, nem sou veterinário, né? Mas a minha observação, ela é... O que eu vou falar aqui é baseada na minha observação, né? E fica evidente que quanto mais se usa de antibiótico, vamos dizer, né? Pior é, vamos dizer assim, né? Quando se... Lógico, muitas vezes para controlar a doença você tem que usar mesmo. Agora, o uso de antibióticos em larga escala, seja para gente, seja para bezerro, né? E infelizmente a gente vê muito disso, é uma coisa que para mim fica cada vez mais evidente que é uma coisa que a gente tem que mudar, e à medida que aparecem novas tecnologias que permitem não usar ou usar menos, isso é melhor. Um dado que o Michael mostrou aí foi o trabalho que eles fizeram lá, usando o colostro como um terapêutico, né, vamos chamar assim, com resultados interessantes. Então, a gente como técnico tem que olhar para isso, né, o que a gente pode de fato fazer, contribuir, levando conhecimento para as fazendas, essas novidades que a gente vê nessas apresentações, para tentar, de fato, mudar um pouco esse quadro de necessidade de uso de muito antibiótico. Ele tem que ser usado quando necessário, mas eu ainda vejo muito exagero por aí, sabe?
Legal. O Ricardo, e na outra linha, ele mostrou muitas diferenças que tem, mesmo a gente colocando a composição básica que a gente conhece, de GG, proteína, gordura, mas o colostro é muito mais do que isso, né? Tem os ácidos graxos, tem os peptídeos, tem uma série de outras oportunidades. E nessas mudanças nascem produtos, né? Oportunidades de produtos. Você tem visto alguma coisa, acho que às vezes nem sem a necessidade de citar a empresa, que tem crescido muito com a utilização aí no mundo, nessa fase?
Cara, eu tenho visto empresas aí que estão usando os sucedâneos de colostro, né, os substitutos de colostro, até com foco em não ter colostro suficiente na fazenda, portanto você vende, mas eles têm um valor agregado bem alto, né, que muitas pessoas não entendem isso como benefício. Existem pesquisas bem profundas e já sendo feitas há um bom tempo, principalmente tentando isolar os oligosacarídeos do colostro, né, e vender isso de forma separada, mas ainda eu particularmente não conheço nenhum produto comercial, porque é um processo relativamente difícil, sabe? O isolamento e manter essa molécula ainda intacta a ponto de ser usado, eu não vi ainda. Posso estar errado, né, mas assim, eu não acredito que não tem ainda. Mas é claro que os bioativos já são muito estudados há muito tempo e vê muita coisa boa, né? Os peptídeos, como você falou, já tem vários produtos aí com peptídeos no mercado, alguns com peptídeos no mercado que funcionam bem para bezerros, né? Mas não necessariamente vindos do colostro.
Beleza. Pessoal, novamente agradecer os nossos parceiros, né? Estão aí para vocês na tela. Nós temos aí o último terço aí do webinar, da gente discutir um pouco mais de conteúdo, e depois a gente vem com as perguntas finais. Bora lá, Gabriel.
Beleza, bora lá.
So the last part I'd like to discuss is weaning. This is something that our lab group has been studying for over 10 years. It's quite fascinating. Some of the first studies that I ever did in calves, actually with Dr. Ken Leslie, really motivated me. My first study with calves was with Ken Leslie on weaning. So shout out to Ken Leslie. Kudos to him for getting me into calves. I really appreciate that. And we've compiled a lot of research in this area. So age, I think, is probably the most critical. You should not be weaning calves less than 8 weeks, especially if you're feeding high levels of milk. Even longer, going to 10 weeks. In Europe, they're at 12 weeks in most cases. I think age is probably the number one factor, even over a step-down protocol. Weaning later is always better. But a step-down protocol is pretty critical as well, and you should have greater than 2 weeks with multiple steps. It shouldn't just be one step. Also, solid feed, I think you have to be careful. I think we overestimate how much forage a calf can consume at this age. Their rumen is really not that large. They can't fill it with forage. So I think we always have to be offering over 85% concentrate. And I think that we should just be aware of the starch. Now, there's not a lot of great literature in this area, but I think that we should just keep our eye on it, and I'll explain why later. Also, housing, group housing, and avoiding changes, I think, is really critical. I'm not going to discuss that. I'm just going to focus on some of the new concepts with respect to nutrition and physiology, but I think that that's also very critical. Now, this is what happens in a calf, very quick transitions. If you're a gut physiologist like me, you love this stuff because you get this very dramatic change in the forestomach in a very short period of time. So basically from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, you're changing this rumen so much. With respect to the total volume of the forestomach, it's being reduced from 25, it's increasing from 25 to 80. This abomasum is reducing from 60 to 7. So big changes from a gross morphology standpoint. Now, this is what you never, ever want to see, okay? And this is what you see a lot of the times when people try to feed higher levels of milk. In this particular case, it was 15% of body weight being fed to these calves as a volume, okay? So as you can see, they're getting lots of energy all the way up to 5 weeks. And then we have a 1 week step down at week 6. Too early, too abrupt, and these calves cannot consume enough starter to reach equivalent levels of metabolized of weaning stress, and that's why we induce this. But this is a really good example of if there's too much stress, they're not going to be consuming as much starter to make sure that we have a level growth period during this time. And also, ruminal pH is extremely depressed during this time. Now, we don't really have a lot of evidence that ruminal acidosis is a problem. We just know that it occurs. And in this particular study, it's even occurring before they consume over a pound of starter. So at week 5, they weren't consuming even a pound of starter, but as you can see, if you have pH of 300 minutes below 5.2, that's a really severe acidosis. 300 minutes per day below a pH of 5.2. Now, is that good? Is it bad? We don't really know. We just know it occurs. And it does take some time for this rumen to develop. These animals were fistulated, but what was really interesting is that even at this time, they were not actually growing their papillae very well. In fact, it took until about week 12 until the size really increased, and likely that's probably why the pH actually elevated, and then the minutes below these pH thresholds actually decreased. It's probably the total volume of the rumen, but also the surface area of rumen papillae absorbing all this acid. Now, we did many studies looking at different weaning strategies. We sequenced the DNA within the rumen. We dissected, we looked at rumen papillae measurements extensively. And to be very frank with everyone, it was very difficult to actually show differences, even when you have these dramatic differences in overall rumen papillae surface area. And we started to think more about monogastrics and how they go through weaning stress, and the focus is the small and large bowel. So we wanted to take a closer look at this area, and perhaps some of this weaning stress we could be picking up more even in the small and large bowel rather than the forestomach. The first data that really showcased this to me was when we looked at a very abrupt weaning earlier in life versus a step down. Okay, and we noticed that a step down that was 12 days versus an abrupt that was 0 days, pulling milk off a high volume of milk. This really caused an elevation in fecal starch. We don't like this because we're wasting starch, first of all, but it also could be causing a hindgut acidosis. And this is why you see bubbly manure and lots of inconsistent manure during this time. So I think if you go into your weaning pens or your post-wean pen and you see a lot of bubbly manure, this is something to just keep your eye on, okay? I think that your weaning model should be adjusted. perhaps the composition of your starter should also be adjusted based on your milk feeding level. And this is a concern because if we have a hindgut acidosis, we know that the expression of tight junctions, so the glue, these proteins that glue the cells together within the intestine, are decreased during weaning. We also noted through some work that we did with Dr. Greg Penner's lab at the University of Saskatchewan. In this experiment, we weaned the calves early at day 40. And as you can see, weaning does increase gut permeability in these calves. Okay, so it's a model for increasing gut permeability. So you have most likely a hindgut acidosis, lots of toxins, and then all of a sudden you have a leaky gut. It's most likely you have a lot of inflammation happening, not just from the forestomach, but probably the small and large bowel as well to consider. Now, this is still a hypothesis, okay? But it's something that I think that we should think about more. Because, and thanks to Dr. Mike Van Amberg, he provided this slide, just a summary of all the different variations of starter compositions. And this is just looking at the carbohydrate fraction. We're not even looking at the protein. I don't want to overwhelm you, but it's not just milk replacer where the formulations are very different. It's also starters. Look at this. The starch can range from 10% to 51%, okay? Same with the sugars are all over the map, same with NDF, same with the soluble fiber. So what are we doing here? Why are we feeding such high starch too? That's another question I have. I'm not really sure, and it's still a hypothesis, whether this is a good thing, especially if we're feeding higher levels of milk. Okay, now what do I mean by that? I was lucky enough to work with Jim Quigley at Cargill before he retired, and we did a study looking at low milk replacer or high milk replacer being fed, and then a low starch versus a high starch. And what I want to point out here is that these calves actually grew relatively similar with respect to the amount of starch. It was a pelleted concentrate, but they did behave differently based on their milk feeding level as well as their starch composition, as you can see here during weaning. So you can see the group that had the biggest dip in their overall average daily gain was the group fed high milk, okay, and also high starch. So I think that this is just one example. Perhaps we should be looking at the milk feeding scheme and matching it with the composition of the starter. Because I think that you can actually feed high starch starters if you're feeding low milk. Now, I don't recommend that, but I think it's different based on the feeding scheme. It's probably different based on the milk replacer composition. I think finding that match is probably the future. So I think that you're going to see many different feeding schemes, and we're going to be feeding animals individually in the future. So for example, in the top right here, you're seeing a milk replacer feeding station that can feed 4 different lines of milk. That's fascinating. So we can feed different milk replacer compositions or whole milk, or maybe a colostrum at different time points during its life. Also, the starters. If you look at the picture on the left, you can actually feed multiple starters out of some of these systems, which is really interesting. Based on the time, you can actually feed a different amount of starter or a different composition of starter. I think eventually we're moving in this direction where we're going to have individualized calf feeding schemes. We're going to be sensing information from them, and we're going to be adjusting the feeding scheme based on this information. Now, first things first, we don't even feed as a percentage of body weight. Perhaps we should start there, but then I think that we're going to be looking at different compositions and different feeding schemes. And I'll give you some examples of that. So for example, we're already weaning based on starter intake. Here's a classic example that my colleague, Dr. Costa from Vermont always uses. We always look at this beautiful red line, which is our average, but we can note that there's some calves that consume no starter even up to day 48, okay? There's some calves consuming some pretty decent amounts of starter that could potentially be weaned over a kilo, even at day 38. So why are we putting them on the same weaning program? We should be taking the starter intake data, and we should be recognizing the animals that consume a lot of starter and wean them earlier. The calves that are not consuming enough starter, we probably should intervene here and find a different weaning mechanism so that we don't have this very abrupt weaning where they go basically from 0 kg of starter to 2 to 3 kg of starter in a week. So that's just one example. We also published a paper. This is done by Dr. Kristen Edwards, who's a PhD student of Dave Renault. And in this farm, they fed lots of milk. It was a little too early, I think, for weaning. And that's why we did this study. They weaned right around here. So between 57 and 64, they had a one-step weaning program off high levels of milk. Not to the advantage. I like the high feedings of milk, but it should be longer, should be a little bit later. But because of their facilities, they were not able to do this. So what we did is we put colostrum within this. So just a little bit of colostrum, just over 100 grams per day substitution for the actual milk. And as you can see, no differences in growth because of that. But later on, there was a growth difference from these animals that actually received colostrum. So most likely we're repairing the gut. There's less stress due to the colostrum treatment, and these animals are performing better. So I think that there's probably opportunities where we can actually feed based on starter intake, but also add different bioactives. This is looking at colostrum, but even a probiotic could be a good example. I think that this is the future, getting this information, giving it back to the calf, whatever they need. So something that I didn't really touch upon is that this post-weaning period. So I've been really talking about things all the way up to 2.5, maybe 3 months. But after this point, it's a real black box. I think that there's lots of opportunity here. We know that this calf is extremely efficient for 2 months after weaning. I think we should capitalize on this by feeding a lot of high quality starter during this time ad libitum, or grower at this time ad libitum, and then gradually decline onto a higher forage diet by that 6-month mark. But again, this area is really wide open, and our knowledge of how it impacts production and the phenotype later on in life is really wide open as well. So an exciting area to study. So in review, I think there's lots of opportunities because of all these health challenges that we're still facing on farm. And I think the way that we've been feeding animals really needs to be challenged, especially the neonate. I think that we can actually feed more colostrum. Now, I just want to also say, I'm not saying to feed extremely large volumes of colostrum, everyone, okay? I'm not saying that. I think there's been some misconception of some of our research. I'm saying, let's consider going from 10% of their birth body weight and volume, maybe to 12. Hey, if they could suckle it, why not go to 15? Okay, let's consider these things with a really, really high quality colostrum. Also pre-weaning, I think that you can consume these large meals. These calves can consume them, even feeding 2 times a day. There's no transport in that first week. And I think the composition of milk replacer is quite fascinating. Does it have a long-term impact? I'm not sure at this point, but we know that it does change the phenotype of this animal during the pre-weaning period. Last, but certainly not least, is weaning. So I think delayed and gradual weaning is essential, but there's large opportunities here with respect to starter composition and how to match the feeding scheme of the milk as well as the starter. So with that, I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you have. You can send me an email. Might be, I'll try my best to respond. I'd really like to thank, firstly, my lab. So while I'm doing my webinar, they're all in the lab or at the research facilities to collecting samples. So I really want to thank all of my grad students, postdocs, and technicians that make this work possible.
Fenômeno. Essa terceira parte muito interessante que a gente vê, eu estava falando com uma turma sobre ração, né? Às vezes o pessoal fala, eu tenho uma ração 20%, 18%, 22%, mas e os outros 80%? Ninguém fala. Que é a maior parte, né? E eu só estou falando de 20% de proteína que a gente nem proteína analisa. Então a gente precisa falar mais, ele mostrou os números aí, a gente precisa falar mais dessa ração inicial, né? Variando aí de 20% de FDN a 40% e 20% de amido a 40% de amido. É muita coisa, né, Alexandre? O que é o seu posicionamento sobre isso?
Marcelão, é muito interessante isso. E uma coisa que eu já falo há bastante tempo, né, me incomoda profundamente, para ser muito sincero, essa questão de, ainda no Brasil, o teor de proteína bruta de rações ser sinônimo de qualidade. Né? Assim, isso vale para ração de vaca leiteira, por exemplo, uma ração 24 ela é tida como melhor que uma ração 20. E esse é um conceito errado, bicho. Nutricionalmente está errado, não é melhor, ela é diferente. Né? O fato de ter mais ou menos proteína por si só não significa ser melhor ou pior, mas existe um conceito generalizado que muitas vezes é utilizado até comercialmente para posicionar produto. Então, eu acho que isso vai ao encontro do que você acabou de dizer, né? E o resto? Beleza, pode ter lá 22%, 24% de proteína e todo mundo fala, nossa, fantástico, a ração é excelente. E o resto, o que tem lá dentro? E é exatamente isso que foi mostrado no partes do webinar aí, né? Que tem muito mais do que proteína nessa ração. Né? E que a gente tem que olhar para essa composição, para a forma física, né? Aquele dado que ele mostrou, ele até citou o João Costa, grande amigo, a variabilidade de ingestão de ração na época do desmame é absurda dentro da fazenda. Né? E as fazendas, infelizmente, eu vou me permitir aqui fazer um comentário que talvez possa ser um pouco agressivo, mas em pouquíssimas fazendas têm de fato a noção do quanto as bezerras estão consumindo de ração nessa época do desmame. E você chega na fazenda e fala, come 1 quilo, come 1,5 quilo, come, assim, e na verdade não sabe, né? E eles mostram claramente que a variabilidade é muito grande. Então tem muita coisa que a gente precisa olhar que vai muito além desse teor de proteína bruta, né, Marcelo? De fato é isso, né? O que mais tem na ração? Né? As bezerras estão, de fato, ingerindo, né? Além do teor da proteína, qual é a qualidade dessa proteína que está lá? Né? Tem fibra? Quanto tem de amido? Cara, a variabilidade em teores de amido, né? Lá, imagina aqui o que a gente tem no nosso mercado. Então, talvez aprofundar um pouco essa discussão ou olhar com mais detalhes para o aspecto seja fundamental, né, para a coisa melhorar.
Uma coisa, se eu puder puxar assunto isso aí, eu tenho visto aí, andando, né, e também atendendo algumas fazendas, que se olha muito para o ganho de peso, né, e obviamente vindo da ração inicial, essa ideia de comer 1 quilo para desmamar, né, mas, e você puxou o assunto antes da composição, acho que foi o Alexandre, da composição do ganho, e assim, a maioria das fazendas do Brasil não tem balança, você vai pisar na fita, a fita é boa até sei lá, talvez até 200 quilos, depois ela começa já a não ser tão adequada, mas eu trabalhei na Provime americana, né, junto com o Mark Hill, junto com as pessoas que fizeram muitas dessas pesquisas, e eu vejo que uma ferramenta simples e interessante de implementar no campo é uma régua para medir a altura e largura desse animal. Porque eu tô atendendo uma fazenda, a fazenda assim, é bem controlada, sabe? Tem muitos dados e estão com problema de ganho de peso das bezerras. Daí, quando eu fui avaliar de perto, elas não tinham caixa. Elas tinham um ganho um pouco aquém do que queriam, mas tinham ganho, mas elas não tinham estatura, elas não tinham largura, sabe? Elas estavam crescendo provavelmente barriga, bucho. Então, assim, talvez por falta de balança, eles fazem ainda na fita, mas por falta de balança, você tem um esquadrinho de madeira que você trava aqui e tem uma medida, tanto na anca do animal quanto na altura de cernelha. Meu, isso aí pode ajudar demais, é uma coisa simples, né? É uma régua de madeira que sobe e desce e põe para os lados. Isso aí você pode ter uma ideia se o animal realmente está crescendo com estrutura óssea, com talvez uma aferição indireta de deposição muscular e tudo isso. Isso é muito importante.
Legal. E na outra linha que eu gostei um comentário dele, que a gente está fazendo muito, e me surpreendeu, muito amido fecal, tanto para vaca quanto para boi. E a gente viu um trabalho agora recente mostrando o impacto na acidose intestinal, né, aumentando o amido nas fezes. E ele mostrou aí, né, quando tem desafios, distúrbios aí, ou rações distintas, tem um aumento no amido fecal. Você quer comentar alguma coisa sobre isso, Ricardo?
Comento. Realmente, né, a função intestinal é reduzida e a digestão de amido, que já não que é boa nos bezerros, que na verdade é muito boa, ela começa a ser atrapalhada. Eu acho que uma coisa que eu quero pontuar aqui, que talvez seja ainda um conhecimento um pouco vago, é digestão de amido em bezerras, né? Imagina-se que um fubá, como em vaca, um fubá, ele tem uma digestão muito maior do que um grão inteiro para a vaca, certo? E acredita-se que em bezerra é a mesma coisa, só que existem dados e dados e dados mostrando que a digestibilidade do amido para bezerras é quase que independente da forma. Então, um amido fubá aí, você vai ter em torno de 98% de digestibilidade em bezerras, e um milho grão vai ser em torno de 96, 97% de digestibilidade. Ou seja, pouca diferença comparado às diferenças que a gente vê em animais já desmamados há mais tempo e adultos. Tá? E eu queria trazer essa atenção, porque isso vai ligar à forma que é entregado esse amido ao animal, né? A pessoa coloca na ração, vai fazer aquela ração amarelinha, bonitinha, sem nenhum, quase que peneirada, né, sem nada grande, mas na verdade você ter grão inteiro na ração das bezerras é vantajoso. Ou na verdade não faz diferença comparado ao fubá, portanto você economiza mais dinheiro e você pode ter ainda um alimento com um pouco maior de fibra, um pouco mais de estimulação. Isso é uma coisa que eu aprendi não há muito tempo, tenho visto, né, antes de sair nos Estados Unidos já aplicando um tanto bom disso aí, mas queria trazer a atenção.
Fechou, pessoal. Nós estamos hoje, acho que é o quarto encontro que a gente está fazendo. Toda vez a gente está trazendo algo que é muito importante para qualquer um na pecuária de leite. A gente quer que a fazenda tenha mais dinheiro. No próximo, aproximadamente daqui 15, 21 dias, nós vamos trazer algum conteúdo legal. Nós também estamos pensando aí na questão do dia e no horário, né, para facilitar mais para todos. E queria deixar aqui aberto para fazer as considerações finais aí do Alexandre e do Ricardo.
Bom, vamos começar aqui. Acho que foi um conteúdo muito bacana. A equipe deles já tem muitas pesquisas interessantes. Então, foi uma apresentação muito legal. Eu acho que eu queria deixar, Marcelão, não é nem uma mensagem, mas talvez uma provocação aí, para ver se de fato as fazendas fazerem uma reflexão para ver se elas de fato estão fazendo uma boa colostragem onde tudo começa, né? Assim, tudo começa lá atrás e todo o resto decorre disso. Falo isso porque eu vejo muita fazenda com aparentemente bom manejo, utilizando bom programa de alimentação, aleitamento, ração de boa qualidade, mas ainda com alta morbidade, alta mortalidade, e aí quando a gente vai olhar, tem problemas sérios na colostragem, né? Então, não tenho dúvida que tem muita coisa a melhorar, oportunidades para melhorar, e a gente tem que estar atento para o que as pesquisas mostram que tem de novo, mas acho que foi um tema muito bom, foi uma satisfação enorme estar com vocês aqui, e na próxima vamos estar aí de novo.
Valeu, Alexandre.
Gostei bastante do tema, acho que é sempre importante relembrar a bezerra, né? Por mais que ela não traga aí dinheiro por 2 anos para a fazenda, ela é sempre o futuro. E devagarzinho a gente vai aprendendo a olhar elas com mais carinho. Agradeço de novo pela presença no webinar, por disponibilidade de discutir aí um pouco dividir um pouco do conhecimento com vocês. Bom final de semana e até o próximo webinar.
Até a próxima.
É isso aí, pessoal. Agradecer de novo nossos parceiros, todo mundo por trás das cenas aí, o Gabriel ajudando a gente, e nos vemos aí daqui 15, 21 dias. Um abraço. Com Deus
Um
a
abraço,
todos.
bom final de semana. Até mais.
Até mais.